Bismillahirrahmanirrahim and Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Hardborn Islamic Study Circle HISC Seerah session 156. So the last session we talked about the Prophet ﷺ. It was the last session we did following the Khaybar battles, and it was the Prophet ﷺ's marriage to Sufiyan, and we talked about her narrating a childhood incident where the Prophet ﷺ arrived in Quba, and she heard her father and her uncle talking how they recognized that he was the Prophet that Allah had promised, but that they would, this is Safiya's father and uncle, would be the enemies of the Prophet ﷺ, because they couldn't take the fact that Allah had chosen an Arab to be the final messenger and not someone from the Jewish tribes. So she has that seminal memory when she was a young girl, overhearing her father and her uncle talk. And then fast forward 5 or 6 years or 7 years, she marries someone called Kinana. She has a dream with after a few weeks of marriage, and she sees the moon rising above Medina and then dropping in her lap. She tells that dream to her husband, who slaps her in the face and gives her a bruise. Following the Battle of Khaybar, she's given to Dihya, and we'll talk about Dihya al Kalbi again, and as one of the properties from the Ghanima, and then he's told to give her back because she's from a noble heritage. And the Prophet ﷺ, he repurchases her as a slave and then frees her and marries her. And then we talked about some of the incidents in her life which shows her sincerity to Islam, and some of the things that happened on the journey back, and how Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, he stood guard the whole night when they finally got married, because he was afraid that, because her father, her uncle, her husband, and had all been killed by the Prophet ﷺ, that she might get up to mischief, but that wasn't the case. We talked about some of the sort of stories the co-wives had, and their mocking and teasing of her because she's from Bani Israel. And we finished off with a couple of final pointers from some learning from Khaybar. This is where muta and temporary marriage was outlawed, and we talked about some partnership contracts like al-Mazara, and how the Prophet ﷺ, he launched some attacks on some other Jewish fortresses, Wadi al-Qurra, and the Jews of Taima. They signed a peace treaty. So again, there's no harm in just going over the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. So there was the first wife is Khadija, and then after that it's, who did he marry? He married Sauda, and then Aisha, and then did the Hijrah, and then Hafsa, and then his fifth wife is Zainab bint Khuzaymah, but then she passed away within 6 to 8 months of the marriage. Then he also married Salama, Juwayriya, we talked about, Zainab bint Jash, we talked about, and Habiba, also known as Ramla bint Abi Sufiyan, who was from Abyssinia, or was living in Abyssinia, and now there's Safiya binti Huyay. And here we're in the sort of 7th year of the Hijrah. So there's a lot of things that are happening. So we've done the Treaty of Hudaibiyyah, and we've got the peace treaty, and we talked about how the Prophet ﷺ, after the Battle of the Ditch, said that they're going to they're going to be more aggressive in their posture. But now, following the Treaty of Hudaibiyyah, there's a completely different phase in how the Prophet ﷺ, he's spreading Islam and his posture. And so there's a very different foreign policy objective now from the Prophet ﷺ. So Hudaybiyyah, it marked a new phase for the Muslims. The Quraysh the Ghatafan tribes and the Jews. We talked about them being a tripartite of enemies against the Prophet ﷺ, and they would conspire with each other to try and attack the Prophet ﷺ, and they posed, united certainly, an existential threat to the Muslims. So the Prophet ﷺ, he'd signed a peace treaty with the Quraysh, so there's no need to worry there. He'd been sending some platoons to deal with some of the Bedouin tribes, of Ghatafan and the other Bedouin tribes, and now he's broken the back of the Jewish resistance by, taking Khaybar. And it was because of the Jewish tribes in Khaybar, they had been instigating the Ghatafan tribes and paying them as mercenaries, essentially part of their plotting and scheming to attack Medina. So a lot of these things were now sort of abating, and Prophet was having the upper hand. And so there's two other things he does now. He maintains his military activity, so we see a different form of military activity now. He doesn't need to attack the Quraysh. He's dealt with the Jewish threat, and now he's looking outwardly and more internationally. And again, he's and another thing that he's doing, which we'll start off talking about now, is a specific form of Dawah. So we can see now that there's active Dawah, spreading Islam, the call of Islam, beyond the reach of Makkah and his particular area of influence, his territories. So he initiates a correspondence, letter writing campaign to a lot of the kings and governors and princes in the neighboring areas. So now, from being a state that's constantly under threat, the victory of Hudaybiyyah has now allowed him to have a completely different posture, a very outward-looking posture, and he's writing to these other kings and dignitaries and actually inviting them to Islam beyond his little area, beyond the area of Arabia where he's been operating. So he mentions, and again, this probably happened straight after Hudaybiyyah, that the Prophet mentioned he needs to start writing to these other people, and probably the first letter he wrote was to the Najashi in Abyssinia, because that's linked with them potentially sending back the Muslims to Medina. And again, we talked about how Abdullah bin Jahsh, he came back at the end of Khaybar. But we're not going to talk about that letter first. We'll talk about the letter to the Caesar, to the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, or what we now call the Byzantium Empire, but Eastern Roman Empire. And again, the Prophet probably didn't just sit down at one point and write all these letters. I mean, it said in some places he wrote up to 20 letters, but we'll go through probably half a dozen of these letters. But it's over a period of time. We don't know exactly. We don't have the chronology of when the letters were sent. So some of the biographers, they put the letters straight after Hudaybiyyah, some put them after Battle of Mu'tah, some put them in different places. But what we can surmise is that there's the Prophet sent quite a few letters, and as he's about to send the letter, the advice that he gets is that for you to send it to emperors and kings, you need to have a bit of authority, that you need to be recognized as the ruler of this area. So in order for them to treat you seriously, you need to have the trappings of a head of state. And so if you're sending a letter, you really need to have a seal, right? So these official letters, which will be written in as an official document, they need to have a seal, a wax seal, and that is a sign that you're the head of state. So the Prophet said, okay, what do I need to do for that? They said, well, why don't you make a ring and then have your seal on that ring? And that's, so you'll see some of those pictures of where it says, Allah, Rasul, Muhammad, that was the ring of the Prophet, and he would use that to seal the letters. And that practice was adopted because it's recognized in international fora as being the way that heads of state correspond to each other. And again, it's an item of technology, of progress, and so there's no harm in the Muslims adopting this system. It's not linked to a particular way of life or a value system. But the other important thing with this letter writing to foreign kings and delegations is that this is a major affair. This is essentially, if you step back to how the process was, what he's doing is he is challenging the international politics. At that point in time, there was essentially in the known world, the civilized world, let's say, it was a bipolar existence. There were two superpowers. There was the Roman Empire and there was the Persian Empire. And the Roman Empire again was split into two, in Rome and in Constantinople. And then you had the Persians. So it was a bipolar world. And so they were busy fighting each other, and they, none of them gave any credibility or credence to the rise of this new religion and this new ideology. But what the Prophet ﷺ is doing is just, a small bunch of Arabs sending letters to these kings, basically saying, "Follow me, hand over the rule of your kingdom to me, so I can rule by the rule of Allah." So take the ruling from men and give it to the rule of the Creator. And this is this puts the process firmly on the map. It's a political statement, but it's a very bold and audacious statement to say, you need to follow me. I am the prophet of God, right? So think of somebody in this day and age, some poxy little place that no one's heard of, writing to the rulers of the free world, or writing to the rulers of America or Russia or China to say, hand over your empire, your system to me, let me govern you. And that's what the Prophet is saying. So it's no mean feat. And if it could be misinterpreted, you're actually inviting these other power players to take notice of you, and if anything, to attack you. If they don't like what they hear, you're giving them an excuse to come and attack you. So this is a fundamental change in the way the Prophet ﷺ is thinking and how Dawah is now operating. And you can see how the Prophet ﷺ is now looking to spread Islam in a very different direction to how he's been. And again, the Treaty of Hudaibiyyah was central in allowing him the time and space and the ability to do that. So the Prophet ﷺ, it's stated after Khaybar, he stood up on the minbar and he said, "Look, I wish to send you as delegations to foreign kings, and I don't want you to dispute amongst yourselves over me. Just like I don't want to be the cause of dispute, like in the times of Bani Israel." So both in the times of Bani Israel and later on, when Isa was around, or after Isa, it was that the kings and the emperors who changed the religion. And the Prophet ﷺ is saying to people, don't fall into the same trap of changing the religion to please the kings. Okay, this is a weighty task. And also, Prophet ﷺ it's a risky business sending these emissaries into the court of these people, because you don't know how they're going to react. So they could react harshly. There's no guessing how people will be. So the Prophet, he's got his seal made on his ring. He's given the intention that he's going to write to people. So we'll talk about one of these letters, which is to the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, Heraclius. Now, Heraclius, he was born in Carthage, which is in modern-day Tunisia, and he became an emperor in 610, Christian era. And this was a time when the Sassanid Persian Empire was on the offensive, and they were actually sweeping back a lot of the Roman territories. So in 613, Damascus fell. In 614, Jerusalem fell and was under the Persian rule at the time. And so this was in the early years of Heraclius. And he reigned from 610 till about 641. So quite a long time, over 30 years. So in the early days, the Sassanid Persian Empire was making great inroads into the Eastern Roman Empire. And this is referenced in Surah Rum, and we talked about this before during the Battle of Badr, where Allah says in the Qur'an that or before the Battle of Badr, that Allah mentions when the Muslims are in Makkah before the Hijrah, that the Persians are winning now, but within 3 to 9 years, the tables will turn and the Romans will start to win, and you will hear of this great victory and you will be really happy. And then they got news of that victory on the day of Badr, where the victory of Badr, and this is mentioned in Surah Rum, where Allah specifically prophesied that the Persians would be defeated, and that's what's happened. And so there's a big battle between these two big empires, the Roman Empire and the Sassanid Persian Empire. And as I said, the Persians had conquered most of Iraq, Syria, Damascus, and Jerusalem, and then made inroads into parts of Egypt before Heraclius, changed his strategy, turned the tide and started fighting back and then regaining these places. And it's said that Heraclius had made a vow that if he recaptures Jerusalem, he would take a pilgrimage there. He would go on foot and do, and do a pilgrimage and restore the relics to Jerusalem. And later on, that's what he did. When he reached the capital of this Sassanid Empire in Ctesiphon, he recaptured a lot of the things that the Persians had looted from Jerusalem. But anyway, Heraclius, they've recaptured Jerusalem, so he's in Jerusalem, and there's a big fanfare, and there's a big sort of ticker tape parade, and he's there. At that point in time, he receives a letter from the Prophet ﷺ. So we'll just go back, before he enacts this barefoot pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The Prophet ﷺ, he writes the letter. He gives it to Dihya al Kalbi to take this letter to the governor of Bosra. Now, Bosra is we talked about Bosra before. It's a trading city by Damascus. So again, it's part of the sort of Roman influence. And so the route was that Dihya al Kalbi would take the letter to the governor or king of Bosra, who, as a Christian, would then take it to the Eastern Roman emperor. But because Heraclius was in Jerusalem, within a couple of days he was able to take it to Heraclius. So in Jerusalem, Heraclius, and this is in one of the books of Seerah, he wakes up one day in a really angry and petulant mood, and the priest asks him why you like this, and he goes, Heraclius says, well, I've had a dream and my astrologers have foretold a very evil sign, that there's going to be a leader of a new people, and these people, they circumcise themselves, and that was the interpretation of the dream. So these priests, they say, look, you've got nothing to worry about. The only people who practice circumcision are the Jews. And if you want, just tell us, and we'll sort of clamp down on them a bit further. We'll squeeze them harder. And again, that's true. The Arabs didn't used to circumcise themselves, but it was only a practice once Islam came. And this is then when Dihya al Kalbi, he arrived in the court with this letter. So Heraclius said, go and check if Dihya is circumcised or not. So they go and they check Dihya, and here they examine him, and lo and behold, he is circumcised. So here Heraclius is starting to get a bit freaked out. And then it said that probably he then wrote a letter to one of his top bishops, perhaps John IV, to say, what should I do about this? And then, this bishop may have then wrote back to him and said, these are some signs of the coming prophet. But that correspondence takes a bit of time. But now you've got Dihya al Kalbi through the king of the governor of Bosra with the letter from the Prophet. And the letter says, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, Most Merciful, from Muhammad, the slave of Allah, to his messenger, to Heraclius, the king of the Byzantines. Blessed are those who follow true guidance. And again, it's written very cleverly. Blessed are those who follow true guidance. So the Prophet is referring to, obviously, the Muslims who follow true guidance, but Heraclius, he could interpret it, in a non-threatening way. And Prophet then says, I invite you to embrace Islam so that you may live in security. Right? There's no beating around the bush. It's become a Muslim. Right? If you come within the fold of Islam, Allah will give you double reward. But in case you turn your back upon it, then the burden and the sins of all your people will fall on your shoulders. And again, in some of the translations, it says the ris'ain, the sins of these people will fall on your shoulders. And some people interpret that as the people who were the true Christians, as in who believed not in the Trinitarian Christianity, but in the Unitarian Christianity, and they followed different bishops. And we talked about this, and when we talked about the story of Salman al-Farsi, who would be going and staying with different bishops, and priests, who held on to this Unitarian view of Islam. And then the Prophet, he quotes. So the Prophet, he's written this letter. So I say, O people of the Scripture, Jews and Christians, come to a word that is just between us and you, that we worship none but Allah, and that we associate no partners with Him, and that none of us shall take others as lords besides Allah. Then, if they turn away, say, bear witness that we are Muslims. So this was the Muslim envoy, Dihya al Kalbi, Dihya bin Khalifa al Kalbi, has given this letter to the king of Bosra, who's taken it to Heraclius in Jerusalem. Heraclius then says, turn Syria upside down until you find someone from this tribe and bring them to me to Jerusalem. So then their guards, they scour the surrounding area around Jerusalem, and at that point in time, Abu Sufiyan, he is actually on a caravan doing a business trip, and he's in Gaza in Palestine. So they find out that their intel says that there's some Arabs in Gaza. They go and they capture these Arabs and they bring them to Jerusalem. And Abu Sufyan doesn't know why they're being brought to Jerusalem. So all these Arabs from these different places are being brought in front of Heraclius into the court of Heraclius in Jerusalem, because he was there on pilgrimage. And then Heraclius, he addresses all of the Arabs through a translator and says, who from amongst you is closest to this man who claims to be a prophet? So then Abu Sufyan, he puts his hand up and said, well, I'm his cousin. Not literally his cousin, I think it's his third cousin, because they go back 3 generations. So then Heraclius, tells his people to bring Abu Sufyan in front of him. So they sit Heraclius in front of. They sit Abu Sufyan in front of Heraclius, and Heraclius says gather his people. So they gather his people behind Abu Sufyan. So Heraclius is making eye contact with Abu Sufyan. Behind Abu Sufyan are Abu Sufyan's people that he's on the business trip with. And Heraclius says, look, I want to know about this man. So Abu Sufyan, because he's still a non-Muslim and he hates the Prophet, he goes, he's a magician, he's a liar. And then Heraclius tells him to shut up. He said, look, I'm not interested in curses. I'm going to ask you some questions. And then he says to the people behind Abu Sufyan, I'm going to ask him some questions. If he lies, just motion to me that he's lying. Right? So Abu Sufyan doesn't know because he can't see behind him. So he has to tell the truth. And so Abu Sufyan knows that Heraclius is a clever man. Right? So Abu Sufyan, he says, look, had I not been afraid that my companions would call me a liar, I would have told lies. Right? But he's in a difficult situation. He's in front of the emperor, and if he says anything bad, his people behind him will correct him, and then he's going to be in a very awkward situation. So then Heraclius starts asking the question, what is his family status amongst you? So Abu Sufyan, he has to reply, he belongs to a good and noble family amongst us. And you've got to think, Abu Sufyan, who hates the Prophet, who hates the Muslim, he's having to, through gritted teeth, answer all of these questions truthfully. So he belongs to a noble family. So Heraclius says, okay, has anybody amongst you ever claimed the same, as in to be a prophet before him? And Abu Sufyan says, no. He goes, okay, was anybody amongst his ancestors a king? So was the Prophet's ancestors a king? Abu Sufyan says, no. Do the nobles follow him, or do the poor people follow him? I think, well, it's the poor who follow him. So Heraclius said, are his followers increasing or decreasing by the day? Abu Sufyan has to admit they are increasing. Does anybody amongst his people who embraces religion become displeased and renounce the religion afterwards? And he goes, no, they stay on the path. Heraclius says, have you ever accused him of telling lies before this claim to prophethood? So Abu Sufyan says, no, because he's known as the truthful. Right? Does he ever break his promises? No. Then Abu Sufyan slips in, we are at truce with him, Treaty of Hudaibiyyah, but we don't know whether he will stick to it or not. And he says, I couldn't find any opportunity but this to say anything vaguely negative. Right? He says, look, he never breaks his promises, but we've just made a treaty. We don't know if he's going to keep that. Okay? So Heraclius says, have you ever been at war with him? He goes, yes. And what's the outcome of the battle? Sometimes he wins, sometimes we win. And then Heraclius says, well, what does he order you to do? Well, he orders us to worship Allah and Allah alone, and not to worship anything along with him, and to renounce all that our ancestors had said. And he orders us to pray, to speak the truth, to be chaste, and to be in good relations with our kith and kin. So again, Abu Sufyan knows exactly what Islam is all about. So then Heraclius turns to him on hearing this testimony through the translator, and he explains the questions, right? I fully realize that prophets come from noble families. All prophets come from a noble lineage, and that is true. He does not have any previous example of prophethood, so it's not something that he thought, this would be a good idea because he's the first prophet. Since none of his ancestors were kings, then he cannot use this as a way to claim his father's monarchy. And as you tell me that he does not tell lies to his people, so he is, for the more reason, immune to telling lies about Allah. So if he wasn't telling lies before, why would he tell lies about Allah? Concerning his followers, those being weak and growing in number, this is something that is in agreement with the questions of faith, until the latter assumes full dimensions geographically and demographically. That's the way it's always been. It's always the poor who follow him first, and the numbers will increase. And I've understood that there have been no instances of apostasy, people leaving the religion, has yet appeared amongst his followers. And this points to the bliss of faith that finds its abode in the human heart. Betrayal, as I see, is alien to him because real prophets hold in the betrayal. Bidding the worship of Allah, not associating, observing prayer, being honest, the abstinence and prohibition of paganism, these are traits bound to subject him and all my possessions. All right, and I have already known that a prophet would arise, but it never occurred to me that it would be an Arab from amongst you. So the Heraclius, again, he's reinforcing this point that the Jews knew, the senior Christians knew that they are waiting for a prophet. But he says, I never expected that prophet to be amongst the Arabs. And he says, if I was sure, I would be faithful to him, and I might hope to meet him. And if I were to meet him, I would wash his feet. And again, if you know the New Testament, that this is something that it said, reported that Isa would do. He washed the feet of his disciples, right? So Heraclius is saying, as a show of humility, I would wash his feet. So this, when Heraclius said all of this, basically, bearing witness that this is a true prophet, then a huge hue and cry started within the court of Heraclius. Lots of the bishops and senior ministers were saying, what the heck is going on here? And then as soon as this brouhaha happened, Abu Sufyan was ushered out of the court. And Abu Sufyan, as he's coming out, he says, and again, he's still a non-Muslim at this point, he said to his companions, this matter of Ibn Abi Qabsha, and this is their derogatory way of referring to the Prophet, this matter of Ibn Abi Qabsha has become so prominent that even the king of Banu al-Afsar, the Romans, is afraid of him. And then I continue to believe that Allah's messengers would be victorious, and then until Allah made me embrace Islam. Basically saying, this is the first time it got me thinking that the Muslims would become victorious. So this is basically where the tide turned for Abu Sufyan, right? In the court of Caesar, he's now realizing that this issue of the Prophet ﷺ, it's going to dominate everything, right? So this is a really important conversation. And then it said that Dihya al Kalbi, when he was sent back from the court, he was sent back with some gifts. Dihya al Kalbi, he was intercepted by some people from Judam in a place called Hasmi. They looted Dihya al Kalbi. The Prophet ﷺ found out, so he dispatched Zayd bin Haritha with 500 men to the place where the Dihya had been looted, and then they inflicted heavy losses on those people, captured about 1,000 camels, 5,000 cattle, and some of their women and boys. And then the chief of the Judam, he then sent a letter to the Prophet saying, look, I'm a Muslim, this is what's happened. And so the Prophet then asked the people to return to them the goods and got back those things. So there you see the first letter, and again, it's a really important letter, and you get a sense that Heraclius, he's thinking about these things. And then there's another letter, another correspondence that happens between Heraclius and the Prophet ﷺ, and it said this happened during the Battle of Tabuk, where the Prophet ﷺ sent a second letter to Heraclius. So Heraclius is also he's already been primed by the Prophet ﷺ. He's tempted to follow the Prophet ﷺ, and he said that clearly in his letter. And and it's possible that Heraclius has got information back from one of his bishops, and basically Prophet sends a separate letter to Caesar, and Heraclius then responds back with another letter, and he sends this from an Arab from the tribe of Tanuk, and Heraclius says to this Arab that I want you to be my spy, my sort of emissary, and I want you to look out for three things, right? And then report back to me directly. So I'm going to ask you, when you return this reply to the Prophet ﷺ, does he mention the letters that he has sent to me and to other kings? That's the first test. Second test, does he mention the night when my letter will be read to him and what's his reply? And the third thing is see if he has something strange on his back. And again, we talked about this with Salman al-Farsi, the seal of prophethood on his back. So then the Arab from Tanuki, he takes the reply from Heraclius to the Prophet ﷺ. And so the Prophet ﷺ receives the letter and says, look, who are you? He goes, I am from Tanuk and the Caesar has sent me. The Prophet ﷺ, he doesn't open the letter straight away. He says, you should embrace the religion of your forefather Ibrahim and you should become a Muslim. And the man says, well, I'll think about it. And then the Prophet ﷺ, starts having a conversation without opening the letter and says, look, I sent a letter to Seerah, or the emperor of Persia, and he tore it up. So Allah will tear up his kingdom. I sent my letter to the Caesar, and he protected the letter, so Allah will protect his kingdom. And so that's the first point. Does he mention the letter? So then the Prophet ﷺ opened up the letter that Heraclius has sent by this chap, and in the letter is a question. And the question is, your messenger told us that your book mentions Jannah as being as broad as the skies and the earth. So where is Jahannam? If paradise, the gardens of paradise are so big, where is hellfire? So the Prophet then he responds and says, Subhanallah, you're asking Allah to outwit him, right? Where do you think the night goes when the day comes? So that's the second response, right? Does he mention the night when my letter is read to him, right? And again, this is probably the tests that the bishop has said to Heraclius, ask him if he's a real prophet, these three things. And the third thing is the sign on his back, and the Prophet was covering his back. This chap couldn't see it. This chap was waiting around in Medina for the next 2 or 3 days, didn't get the opportunity to see the back of the Prophet. So then he goes back 3 days later and says, look, I'm going to get back to Caesar and tell him, what about the conversation. And so the Prophet says, wait. He turned around, lowered his shirt, showed him the sign of prophethood, and then told the chap, go and tell your Caesar what you have seen. So again, all three things, right? So it depends how sincere is Heraclius. So then Tanuki, he goes back to Heraclius. He says, look, tick, all three signs are there, all right? And so Heraclius, he's in a feverish state. What should he do? He's got confirmation that this is the real prophet, and he's a learned man. He's a military man, but he's also a learned man, a good Christian man, and he wants to follow the prophet. So then he convenes another big court of his special advisors, and just to see where the lay of the land is, and he's testing them out. He basically says, look, he explains the situation with the prophet. We know the prophet's going to come. We've got this person, he claims to be a prophet. Thus, he's the signs are all there. Tick, tick, tick. These are the signs in our books. What do you think if I embrace Muhammad's faith? This is the emperor of Rome saying, Eastern Roman Empire. What do you think if I become a Muslim? And then obviously a lot of his followers will become Muslims. Then obviously there's a big brouhaha in the court. All of the the people around the court, because these are really, people who are highly invested in the status quo. They're rich people, they're noble people. They don't want to change that. So they say, there's no way you, as our emperor, we will allow you to leave Christianity. You can't do this. You can't follow his faith. So then Heraclius goes, no, I was just teasing you. I will never leave Christianity. I was just seeing how you guys would react. But then obviously he doesn't become a Muslim, and then within a few years, his empire starts to slip away. He gets overthrown in a coup, and one of the things he said in the first meeting was, if this is the real prophet, within a few years he will be standing where I am standing, or his people will stand where I am standing. And within a decade, the Muslims had captured Jerusalem, and he could see that. He was alive at the time, right? And so within his own lifetime, his Roman Empire was being carved up. So I'll finish there, but again, just transport you back. This is the Prophet sending letters to the kings and emperors and say, follow me, obey the hukum of Allah, obey my rule. You will be blessed, and your people will be blessed. But again, that's not what happened. So that's the first letter. Inshallah, we'll talk about in future the following letters, which were sent to Najashi, to the Egyptian king, the king of Bahrain, the Persian emperor, and lots of others. So I'll finish there, inshallah. Do remember us in your du'as. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. جزاك الله خير. السلام عليكم.